Hello everyone, this is Derek Hansen, and I haven't posted on YouTube for a while. I got to get back to it, and I thought one of the best ways was to kind of supplement an article that I wrote on my own personal blog. And the idea is we're going to cover the high-low training concept. So I use it in relation to speed training. So we're going to revisit it. I'm going to kind of explain it for people who haven't been exposed to it. And I'm also going to refine and talk a little bit about some of the changes I've made or some of the things that I've noticed over 25 years plus of using this program. And the original introduction to a high-low, or some people call it a polarized approach, is from my work with Charlie Francis, but it started a lot earlier. It was back in 1986. I saw him speak in person, and he touched on the concept back then, and you kind of kept it in the back of your head, and you know that to some degree, some of my training as a collegiate athlete, there were some aspects of that that rang true, that we had this sort of division of work. But it wasn't until I started coaching sprint athletes that I really tried to implement it in a way that I think would manage the training, the speed training, much better. So we're going to go over that. I think one of the first diagrams that I created with Charlie Francis, it was his idea, obviously, but I helped sort of articulate how things should be displayed, was sort of a division of high, medium, and low intensity running velocities. And you'll see in this diagram that if we're looking at high, we're looking at specific adaptations for speed. High central nervous system involvement requires at least 48 to 72 hours of recovery before we can hit it again and get any results. And then on the medium side, you have sort of this in-between, not really that fast, but certainly fast enough to get really fatigued from and just feel awful from. We'll talk a bit more about that, but let's dive into the low intensity. If we talk about high and low, the low intensity is actually very important. More so for general conditioning and recovery and creating a circulatory response that helps with tissue regeneration and flushing out waste products. And I think some people overlook the value of low intensity and they want to get very specific and just do everything fast. So we're going to delve into that a bit. But the medium side, I think, when I was training, if you saw somebody and through team sports training and the coaches are grinding you, the medium stuff is the stuff that makes you want to vomit and it just burns your legs. And when you're doing it, you're thinking, wow, we're working really hard. But at the time, I just thought, hey, hard work is hard work and we're going to get results. But when I started listening to what Charlie had to say about getting specific adaptations for speed, explosive power, you start thinking about, wait, yeah, he's right. I was actually very tired and I was fatigued all the time and I just felt like crap. So maybe if I separated those qualities out, I would have had a better response when I was a younger athlete. So, I think we all revisit what things were like when we were athletes and how could we have made it better. And just having a much more distinct division between high intensity, medium intensity, and low intensity, that seemed to make sense for me. So we're going to go through and talk a bit more about how I recognized how to divide things up, what qualities to separate, and what worked for me. So when you're organizing a typical week of training, you have to make these decisions about, okay, what are similar qualities? What can we divide up and place on the same day that looks the same, feels the same, and gets the same result? So in the case of a typical Charlie Francis organization of work, and what I started with was you have a low intensity day, and then a high intensity day, and then a low intensity day, and a high intensity day, and so on. And the idea would be that you have your high intensity days separated by what we would call more circulatory recovery work on off days. So that may mean you could get 3 speed days or high intensity days separated by these low intensity days, another 3 days. So 6 days of training, 3 high intensity, 3 low intensity interspersed. And that way you would get higher peaks on your high intensity days and you would recover, then get a high peak, then recover. So that was a typical layout and I pretty much followed that to a T when I was coaching sprinters. We'll get into some of the pitfalls of working with that system and things that I found out over time. And then there was a case where I was talking with Charlie and he had an athlete who had been overtrained and really didn't have a high tolerance for high intensity work. So he ended up working on 2 high intensity days separated by as much space as he could have. and then inserted low intensity work around them to make sure that they recovered. And on those 2 days, he wanted to make sure they were firing on all cylinders. So that was very interesting, because sometimes you think, well, we want to get more high intensity work in. But the problem is that if you try to shove too much work into there and they're not recovering enough, those peaks will come down and you're just not going to get the same effect. So there may be a decision in your coaching where you say, hey, that person needs more separation for their high intensity work. We'll consolidate it on those days, and let's, make sure they recover and we get the highest level of quality when they work on high intensity qualities. Something to think about. And perhaps I was always trying to get as much out of my athletes as possible, so always had 3 high intensity days. And now I'm starting to rethink that. And then you'll see what I put down in the article, some of the graphics. You'll see like how I would treat high intensity qualities for a sprinter, a track and field sprinter. And then I kind of compared that to a team sport athlete. Now, you can still have that separation of high and low. The only difference might be that the sprinter, you're heavily loading up on different sprint distances, right? So you might have acceleration one day, you might have max velocity the other day, and then on the third day, you'll have your speed endurance, maybe special endurance, but also maybe some max velocity. So you have different sprint qualities working on each of those days. Now, with a team sport athlete, you're probably not going to sprint to the same volumes that you would with a track and field athlete. So great. So what are you going to fill those high intensity days with? So it could be more plyometrics. It could be more agility, change of direction at a very high quality. There might be some game specific things that you do at high velocity. So for an American football player, it might be running routes for a receiver, and you're trying to hit high velocities and give them adequate recovery between those reps. So you can start to stack your high intensity qualities based on the athlete that you have and the sport that they do, and just make sure everything's compatible. I would say probably for the running based athlete, the track and field athlete, we're trying to access more running based recovery, so tempo runs at higher volumes. Where with a team sport athlete, maybe you try something else. Maybe they're in the pool, maybe they're on a stationary bike because you're worried about the pounding of doing more running. So for larger athletes, maybe they're on a treadmill, elliptical trainer. So you're trying to make these decisions to make those intensity elements compatible with the work that you're doing for that sport. So with the high intensity elements versus medium intensity versus low intensity, I have a table in the article that talks about, okay, what does a high intensity element look like? What is a medium? What is a low? And you'll see high intensity again, plyometrics, sprints, all types of sprints, short accelerations, longer max velocity runs. We get into explosive throws. It could be dynamic weightlifting or maximum strength weightlifting. And there may be, again, some sport specific things. So if you're a baseball pitcher, high intensity would be throwing, or in cricket would be bowling. There may be other aspects to training for a combative athlete that is very high intensity, short bursts. So again, we kind of know what those high central nervous system involvement activities are. So those will be high. Medium's a little tougher. And sometimes people will creep into medium when they're not in shape. So at the beginning of a training program, everybody's out of shape. They're all tired, vomiting, because you're just giving them basic aerobic general fitness stuff and they can't handle it. Okay, great. But usually the medium stuff is going to be that glycolytic, lactic, everybody feels gross. So if you've ever run a 400-meter run or a longer sprint like that, you'll know what that feels like. Or just doing repeat intervals with low recovery and just breaking down. So that's going to be the medium stuff. Feels gross. Sometimes it's necessary. We'll get into that. And then the low intensity side is things that typically are continuous, can be intermittent, but low work to recovery ratio, where maybe they're doing an easy run, they do a short walk, an easy run like they do in tempo running, and then you can do all sorts of circuits, medicine ball circuits or body weight circuits. You can intersperse that, but it is kind of this continuous work, circulatory effect that you're trying to get. So as long as you can distinguish between those high, medium, low activities and then start plugging them into your workout plan, things will work out, pretty good, I would say. And you'll see those differences. If somebody's out of shape, again, it's going to be a little different. But once you get them into shape, they can fall into these categories a little easier. So there's one section in the article where I talk about calibrating your high and low intensity parameters. And if you see in the original diagram that we created with Charlie Francis, it was 95 to 100% of max velocity, or best time. And well, I'll talk a bit about that, but that's sort of like, that's where you're going to get your specific adaptation, and it's taxing enough to create that adaptation. The medium is going to be 95% to about 75%. Debatable, we'll talk a bit more about that. And then anything 75% of best time and slower was considered low intensity. So as you see in the diagram that I created, where I revised it a bit, I've kind of opened up this window of max effort or high intensity to 90% to 100%. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is I found in certain days I could still work in that 90 to 95% range. And if I was working on something technical, if I was trying to get in more volume, or sometimes I tried to shave some of the recovery time so that we could fit more work in, sometimes I gave myself that allowance to have that 90 to 95%, which is still fast. And I still felt that we got positive technical adaptations, more repetitions in. So it gave me some wriggle room to work on things that were still fast enough. Now, if I go to the low intensity side, sometimes I found that it was easier for athletes to go too fast if I said 75%. If I whittled them down to this sort of 65 to 70%, I had less risk of them getting into trouble. So I'd rather have them go a little slower. Maybe we do a little more volume in that 65% range. And I just felt we were safer. So that's what I'm trying to articulate in this diagram, is that, you know, maybe it's better to widen on one end and sort of lessen on the other end. I found it just created an easier environment to work with less risk. So the other thing that I found out really early on was that you couldn't really do an efficient polarized program in the early phases of training. One of the reasons was you had a lot of different qualities to cover, and just by the basic volume covered in a GPP phase, you're going to have, you know, more exercises, probably less recovery, switching from different types of exercises in the same session, doing circuits, and you're just trying to get people into shape. If you're just trying to throw a lot of volume at people, albeit at safe intensities, everything's going to be kind of flat, and you're doing it on consecutive days. So there wasn't this need to really work on speed and explosiveness early on, because it was inherently more risky. So this idea that the more exercises and volume we plugged in, it kind of leveled things off. And then as you go through 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, then things would start to separate. And then you get into more of a specific preparation phase or pre-competitive phase. And then you'd get this more polarized approach where low intensity was well defined and high intensity is when we were getting after it in terms of velocity and explosiveness. So I think that's the one thing that you can sort of massage a bit in the general preparatory phase, is just you can plug in more elements that probably seem, when you eyeball them, to be less compatible, but just because the intensities are lower, everything's flat, and you just kind of work on general qualities. And I think that works pretty good in a preparatory phase. Now, the one thing that we did find out also in working with Charlie Francis was this idea that for beginners, everything is kind of tough, and for the most part, everything you throw at a beginner makes them better. So even if it's not speed specific and you said, okay, we're going to do some tempo runs and longer runs, the simple fact that they're going to get in shape because it's still taxing for them, and maybe it's classified as high intensity or perceived as high intensity by a youth athlete, they're going to get better at sprinting because they're just in better shape, right? If you had somebody who was a beginner, even an adult, and you had them do something as simple as walk up and down stairs, they're probably going to get faster because they were in such poor shape. So just keep that in mind, is that when you're starting with younger athletes, again, you could probably do more volume and you could do sprint activities and jumps and all these things, and they're going to recover pretty fast because their output isn't that high. Now, as you get into more advanced, more mature athletes, then you're going to get the separation of high and low. So when they do a vertical jump and they're jumping over 30 inches, or they're doing an explosive throw, there's going to be more wear and tear on the tissues, but also impact on the central nervous system. So then you have to separate things out. Now, the interesting thing is, as you get older, you kind of revert back to being sort of like that younger athlete. Now, it's a little different though, but because you're not recovering as quickly. So you may throw a high intensity sprint workout at somebody and then find out that, wow, they can't tolerate as much volume. And maybe we have to expand the volume of low intensity work to help them recover faster. And I've seen that in my own training where I just, if I go and do a sprint workout, I need 3 days of separation before, 4 days even, before I can do that again. And then I have to do more circulatory work and just recovery and regeneration work to make sure that I can do that safely the next time. So keep that in mind. There is an evolution over time where working with younger athletes, throw a lot of stuff at them. Working with elite, mature athletes, separate things out, be very careful with your volumes. You can push them a little higher on their high days, but they're going to need more recovery. And then as you get older, that separation grows where you have to spend more time on recovery and low intensity qualities to make sure that they stay healthy and they can still be competing and training at a reasonable level of health. Now, if we get into this discussion of distribution of high versus low, I always started with this 65% low versus 35% high because that was presented to me by Charlie Francis, and he found out in a roundabout way that many of his successful athletes thrived on that 35-65 high-low split. So from that ratio, I've kind of gone either one way or the other depending on the athletes I work with. But 35 high, 65 low, that's what we started with. Now, if we get into looking at different sports and the more explosive you are, shot put, Olympic weightlifting, that's going to divide up more into a 50-50 split where you need more high intensity work if you're doing that sort of acyclical, explosive type activity. But as you go the other way towards endurance, it might be more 20-80, 20% high versus 80% low, or even if you're a marathon runner, even a lower amount of high intensity work. And one of the reasons is if you're an endurance athlete, you need high volumes of work to develop that aerobic system and sustain it and even improve upon it. So as we know, there's certain mileage requirements for marathon runners and long distance runners and swimmers that they have to do. And that's going to be on the low intensity side. That doesn't mean they're not going to do some sprinting, some heavier weights, some sort of plyometrics. But in a relative sense, that's going to be a lot less exposure than what they're doing on the low intensity side with their longer endurance work. So just keep that in mind. And I have a graphic in there where I've kind of studied and talked to people who train horses, thoroughbred horses. And the faster you go, doesn't matter what animal you are or what species you're from, the faster you run, the more low intensity work that you need to support that. So in the case of human sprinters, males need a little more recovery than females, and females can do more high intensity volume just because they're running a little slower. That may change, the women are catching up, but certainly as you move into the thoroughbred horse and into the cheetah, you can see a very, very small proportion of their movement is in high intensity. Because if you're running 75 miles per hour, your body heats up, there's a lot more tissue degradation, and there's more recovery required, and you can only handle a certain amount of high intensity volume. So just keep that in mind if you're working with somebody who tends to be a little faster than the rest of your group. You may have to change things and modify things for that specific athlete so that they don't blow themselves up. I think one of the most important things that I've learned is that it's very easy to get lost in this idea of we have to get faster. We have to work on just speed components. If I'm working with a 100-meter sprinter and I need to shave off a tenth of a second so that they can be in the medals or qualify for a final, the natural tendency is to go, hey, we need more speed volume. We need more high velocity work. The only problem is that if you start pushing too much in that area, bad things can happen, whether it's plateauing, they just can't handle it, they can't recover, so they just stop improving because you're just trying to shove too much work into, a smaller container, and it just doesn't work. So the other thing that you have to consider is that they need more recovery as well. So if you expand on the low intensity side, then it may make them fresher on the days when they're going to do their high intensity work. Remember that example of 3 high intensity days versus 2 high intensity days? Some people may respond with those 2 high intensity days per week because they have more time to recover and they can build up some volume on the low intensity side. So if you're going to try to increase the high intensity work, the proportion, you have to balance it out with low intensity work. And that might mean more tempo runs, more pool work. It might mean some things that are a little more passive on the recovery side, but that has to go up as well. You can't just have one side go up and stay static on the other side. It just won't balance out. You're going to have a problem. And it may not be right away. And you might think, okay, I've moved up more sprint work and I've dropped down our low intensity work, and hey, they're doing really well. There is going to be a point where things don't go so well. And whether it's a soft tissue injury, whether it's, like I said, they plateau. So just keep that in mind, that there is this sort of balance and equilibrium that you're trying to achieve. And you have to take a big picture view and make sure that you're minding all of your variables. But I think the one thing that I've learned is that if I can expand a little on the low intensity side, that's where I'll start. And then I see how, the athlete's improving and see if maybe there's any other thing that needs to be tweaked. And then if that works, maybe I can bring up the high intensity side and just balance it out again. But the concept of balance and equilibrium is very important. So another point that I bring up is that there's less time to train. Most sports seem to be pushing in the direction of let's get more competition in, let's practice the game a little more. But there isn't this appreciation from sport coaches that maybe we need to expand a little more on the preparation, the general preparation, and all these things. So the windows are being squeezed. This is a problem, and this is why we might be seeing more of these overuse injuries and non-contact injuries. So where can we fit in more work? Most of the time I'm trying to get more space in the warm-up area. And again, you'll also see this, especially in pro sports, they don't give them a lot of time to warm up. So if you can negotiate to get an extra 5 minutes or a little bit here or there in practice, competition time, I think that's where you're going to invest some of your effort on the high and low intensity side. So by definition, a warm-up should have low intensity components and high intensity components. And usually you're building up between those. So maybe on the low intensity side, you're doing more continuous work to maintain and develop the aerobic system. On the high intensity side, you're getting some jumps, some throws, some sprints in once their body temperature rises and they're ready to go and their soft tissues are ready for that. But the great thing about the warm-up is it's done every time you see them. So whether it's in training, practice, or in competition, if you have a similar structure and you have some of these components in there, you know that over time you'll accumulate work and you'll have a consistent and persistent way of stimulating them. So I think that's what I've tried to show in my diagrams here, is like you have different parts, components of a warm-up where you can inject specific activities that I think will hit some of these high and low intensity areas. And obviously in warm-up, you don't want to be exhausting people on the medium side. It's just going to create unnecessary exhaustion. There's still inherent risk involved. So high when they're ready, but low to kind of build them up and just generally improve their circulatory system as part of that process. Another area I talk about in the article is looking at all of your exercises and going, okay, what can I do in the gym to help maybe on the low intensity side? It's always easy to say, hey, let's go in the gym and let's move some weight and let's be very explosive and powerful. But maybe there's some activities that you can do in the weight room after practice that fill that low intensity void. And one of the diagrams that I use, another one that I worked on with Charlie Francis, was a motor unit diagram where it shows a distribution of exercises from high motor unit involvement to lower motor unit activities like isolated lifts, like dumbbell curls and easy rows and things like that. So those types of exercises could be arranged in a circuit that allow you to kind of hit these low intensity qualities. There's not going to be residual fatigue. We use medicine ball circuits a lot for that. And by hitting those areas, especially for some athletes that are running a lot, if you want to do some different alternative activities in the gym that don't tax the lower body as much, the impacts of hitting the ground, then looking at some gym activities that are continuous and more of a circuit type arrangement can really work. And I think that's why it's good to look at different exercises along that spectrum of high intensity to low intensity. And then sometimes the low intensity stuff works really well and feeds everything else on the high intensity side. The final point I make in the article is about temperature and weather and environmental conditions. And even recently, if you're dealing with something like forest fires and pollution in the air, that's something that you have to react and respond to. You're not going to send people out to do aerobic runs and long tempo intervals when the air quality is really poor. So what are you going to do as an alternative? So I think I'm always thinking about manipulating high intensity and low intensity in different situations because I can't go outside and run fast because it's snowing out. Okay, what are we going to do inside? Can we do some high-speed treadmill work? Can we do some more plyos? Can we shift a little more to dynamic Olympic lifts or maximal strength work in the gym? Again, you have to learn to think on your feet, but if you organize things in high intensity components and low intensity components and have a big list of different activities, now you can plug and play and make things work for you if you don't have access to a facility that you normally had, if the weather is bad, if there's some other environmental conditions, or you just don't have access to the right equipment for some reason. Somebody else is using it or got damaged. So I'm always thinking about what are equivalents on the high side and the low side that I can just plug in if need be. So what are some final thoughts on this high-low program arrangement? I think for me, it's a great starting point. So it makes you start thinking about classifying exercise. It makes you think about the impact on both the peripheral system, the body, and the central nervous system, the brain, and how things recover. And if you have a good idea of what the impact of these exercises are in that respect, then I think you can start organizing things a lot easier. Now, does it have to be a strict high-low program? Can you have some medium intensity elements in there? Absolutely. You can move things around, but as a starting point with a very simple structure, I think looking at things in terms of a polarized approach is a good place to start. And like I said, if you're working with different sports, say you're a strength and conditioning coach and you're working with, say, 10 different sports, I still think you can organize things in your brain to make it work for each of these sports, whether they're team sports, individual sports, and just having these categories and having these different levels really makes you think about what is the best arrangement, whether it's within the session, whether it's within the week, or how you want to divide things up from phase to phase. And those things can change, but I think you'll become more agile on your feet if you start thinking of things in terms of intensity requirements and balancing out and maintaining some sort of equilibrium depending on the sport. So I hope this was useful. There's a link in the description of how to look for the actual written article so you can kind of review the article as you go through the video. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I'd love to provide a little more information, and maybe I'll do some follow-up videos. But the whole idea here is just to articulate what I've learned over 25 plus years of using this type of approach. And I really haven't gotten away from it. There's been some tweaks here and there, but I feel very comfortable using this approach, even in rehabilitation scenarios where maybe everything starts off being pretty low intensity, but then as people get better, you're going to start to segregate things out and you'll see a difference between one day of rehab may be more of a high intensity day versus a low intensity day. And even my use of electrical stimulation, I've divided into high intensity and low intensity days. So it's just an easy way to arrange all of your work and keep track of things. So thank you very much. I hope to continue to do this where I'm writing articles and having a companion video. So hopefully it just helps with the educational process and helps you as a coach.